Welcome. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist congregation at Shelter Rock. I am the Reverend Natalie Fenimore. I'm part of the ministerial team here at the congregation, which includes the Reverend Ned White, the Reverend Jennifer Brower, and our ministerial intern, Oscar Sinclair. I welcome you to this, our faith community, where the work of peace and justice making is at the core of our spiritual and intellectual lives. Please join us for worship on Sundays at 11. We also have a contemporary worship service monthly on Friday evenings. You will find our campus is full of thoughtful and enriching events and programs like this every day of the week, every day of the year. And we invite you to join us to become part of our community, our fellowship, our circle of care and concern. I know that you will enjoy this evening and our speaker, Medea Benjamin. This program is hosted by our own Shelter Rock Forum and Social Justice Committees in partnership with the Long Island Alliance for Peaceful Alternatives. Our speaker will now be introduced by Mr. Bob Nuxall, the chair of our Shelter Rock Forum. Thank you.
The Shelter Rock Forum is charged with the responsibility to inform not only the congregation, but the community at large by giving a platform to speakers with expertise on the major issues of the day. We are instructed to do so even if those speakers will be controversial. Today, we indeed fulfill that mandate. Mrs. Medea Benjamin was born into a moneyed family in Freeport, Long Island. She did not merely sit on that money, but instead has spent her life informing herself about the lives of the poor and oppressed around the world. She holds degrees from Tufts and Columbia Universities and the New School. Similar to other liberal economists, she is appalled by the defenders of laissez-faire capitalism and the advocacy of national and international economics that allows corporations to use their market power to garner extreme profits, along with political power, to the detriment of the poor and middle classes, and a threat to democracy itself. She has become an advocate for the poor and suffering, who otherwise would not have a voice. Her causes include women issues through Code Pink, Cuba, where she lived until Castro expelled her, opposition to trade agreements favoring multinational corporations at the expense of labor, opposition to the Iraqi war, advocacy of withdrawal from Afghanistan. She stands for the rights of Palestinians. And in her two most recent books, The Immorality and Counterproductivity of Drone Warfare, and finally, Opposition to the Medieval Royalty in Saudi Arabia. In these efforts, she has suffered several arrests, including a night of torture by Egypt's dictatorial police. It's an honor to introduce to you the Nobel Peace Prize nominee, Ms. Medea Benjamin.
Well, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction and for the hearty souls that came out in this pretty nasty weather. I realized as I was coming up, after I had made a lot of notes for my speech tonight, I left them in Hofstra. So you will hear a spontaneous talk and probably a lot of rambling, but I hope you'll bear with me and that we can have a good discussion as well. Because we are in the midst of the unknown right now. And when we look at where we're going, I think I can assume that I'm in a movement here. Well, did anybody here vote for Donald Trump? Anybody want to admit that they voted for Donald Trump? So you say I'm from Long Island. My family here voted for Donald Trump. And they still continue to say that he's wonderful. So you can imagine we have a lot of good family discussions. And I think it's important to have those discussions, though, to see where people are coming from, because some of my family voted for Donald Trump because they are wealthy and they want to make sure that it stays that way, and they think Donald Trump is going to cut taxes even further. And some of them are very working class, and they voted for Donald Trump because they are sick of the two-party system and they thought he was going to shake things up. And indeed, he is shaking things up. I'm not sure it's the direction they had envisioned, but in any case, we have to recognize that there are a lot of people that voted for Donald Trump because, like many of us, they're disgusted with politics as usual. And some might be racist, some might not be racist, but there is kind of a core underpinning of Donald Trump supporters that might have a lot in common with Bernie Sanders supporters, right? That things just should be different than the way they are. And I think when I look at the tremendous uprising now of resistance, I scratch my head and I say, where was it during the last 8 years? And I look at, I loved being in one of the crowds and seeing the sign that said this and had a picture of Donald Trump with that shock of orange stuff on his head. And they said, this is not normal. But normal is not acceptable either. And to me, that kind of said it all. Normal is not acceptable either. And so when you look at all the things that happened during the Obama years, and yes, there were certainly groups like the Black Lives Matter group that came out onto the streets and said, killing our young people on the streets by the very people who are supposed to be protecting us is not acceptable. And there were people from the environmental community who came out and said things like Keystone Pipeline and making more ways to get dirty oil from the tar sands in Canada through areas of our country that are so vulnerable, and to keep us on this treadmill of fossil fuels. This is not acceptable. But for the most part, people were not outraged. It was indeed the first time we had a black president in the White House, and that is a glorious thing, and that is historic and something that many of us will continue to be proud of. And certainly Barack Obama had a lovely family, and boy, do I miss that family. I remember when Donald Trump started running, and we saw these pictures of Ivanka. And I don't know if you've seen some of the racier pictures of Ivanka, but I thought, this woman will never be in the White House. And indeed, she's not in the White House. She doesn't, I guess the White House is not quite good enough for her. But I miss Michelle Obama, and I miss those beautiful children. And, you know, there is something very lovely about the Obama family. But I think the last 8 years really taught us that there are powers in this country that are way bigger than whoever is in that White House. And Donald Trump will come up against it, as he already is. But certainly President Obama came up against it. And just like in the days of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, remember that story when he said, you know, if you want me to do this and to do that for the working people, go out and make me do it. Obama pretty much said the same thing, make me do it. And you know what? We didn't make him do a lot of things. I think we made him be opposed to the Keystone Pipeline. And that was because it was a very good mobilizing effort. And when Obama did not agree to stopping the Keystone Pipeline, that movement, to its credit, said, okay, now we're going to go after Obama, and organize massive resistance right in front of the White House. Was anybody there in any of those wonderful climate marches in DC, where people, over 1,000 people did civil disobedience? And that was really something that forced Obama to, quote, do the right thing. I live in Washington, D.C. now. I came from Long Island, grew up in Freeport, have some friends here from those days. But I moved to Washington, D.C. when Obama came into power because I had been traveling to Washington a lot during the Bush years for all the protests. And my kids were grown, and I thought, well, you know, I actually like DC. I like being in the center where the power is. And now that Obama is there, there's a lot that we can get done. So I moved to Washington, DC. And being there on a pretty much daily basis, you see all the ugly inner workings of our system. So how many of you have gone to Washington, D.C. ever to do any kind of lobbying? And did you get to meet with your representative or an aide? An aide. So it's very hard, even when you go to Washington, or even here, of course, to get to meet directly with your elected official. And of course, now they're scared to death of doing a town hall meeting or anything where they have to actually face the public. But you go to Washington, D.C., and people come all the time, constantly to lobby. And so I'm lobbying all the time as well. And I come with groups that are coming in and very excited that they're going to get a chance to lobby their elected officials. And it breaks my heart because sometimes we'll go into the office and you'll find that you're not even meeting with an aide, you're meeting with an intern. And no offense to interns, I love interns. But you know, people are flying in from around the country. They're really feeling like this is my chance to make my point to my elected official. And they're meeting with somebody who's 21 years old, didn't even bring a notebook, is kind of staring off into space, and you're thinking, maybe they're thinking about where is the happy hour going to be that night. And there you are, you know, there with really important issues, and nobody's really listening to you. And then I have had a chance to lobby where people have more moneyed interest, and they do get a chance to go and have an interaction maybe with the chief of staff, and that seems more significant. But I've also had a chance to lobby with some wealthy groups. There's a group called Women's Donor Network. And they asked me to help them organize in DC. And I've been in DC and doing these lobbying things all the time. Well, I didn't realize there's a special place that the wealthy donors go, and it's not even in their offices. It's a special area where you take a little bus that's only for the congresspeople, or if they authorize you to get on it, and you go in the tunnel, and you go into the Capitol building, and there is a very beautiful gilded kind of room that's right off the room where they do their votes, and that's where the people that have power and influence get to influence their elected officials. And I was stunned because I had never seen it before. I didn't even know that room existed. And there you sit around and you wait. And as you wait at these tables, these congresspeople are coming in to see you. They're coming in off the floor, off of their voting. And guess who else is very visible and present in the room, at least the day that I was there? Generals and people in the military and people from the big weapons manufacturers. I just happened to strike up over the conversation, and there was Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and all these people. They get to go into the inner sanctums. And so whether it's President Bush or President Obama, or now who knows who Trump listens to, but they're constantly being lobbied by people with moneyed interests. And it might be big oil, and certainly big oil has a tremendous presence on Capitol Hill. And it might be the weapons manufacturers, and the weapons manufacturers have a huge presence. Do you know that one of the wealthiest districts in the entire country is right outside of Washington, D.C. in Virginia? And you see mansion after mansion after mansion. Where is this money coming from? It's coming from government contracts. It's coming from, a lot of it is coming from the privatization of the Pentagon. Because let's face it, that's where the money is. And they're getting these enormous contracts, and they're getting just fabulously wealthy from our tax dollars. And so these are the people who have the ear of the government. And you realize that there is this vicious circle that General Eisenhower warned us about back in the early 1960s as he was leaving the White House. His last speech to the American people. Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. And raise your hand if you don't know what I'm talking about. So a couple of people don't. And that is the speech where he said, beware of the power of the military-industrial complex. And it was originally the military-industrial, what, Charlotte? Congressional complex. And rightly so. And now, if you really wanted it to be truthful, it would be the military-industrial, congressional, security, academic, what else can we add? What? Media. What else? Medical. You put all of these. It's a complex that, as Eisenhower said, has gotten so big, and got so big during World War II, that it came to start sucking in the resources of our tax dollars, sucking and sucking and sucking in those resources, and creating its own tentacles and its own vicious circle of a revolving door of people who are in the government, people who are in the military, leave the government and the military, and guess what? They're suddenly on the board of a big corporation. And they go in and out and in and out. And so you see that what has happened to our democracy is that it really has become something in the hands of large corporations who have so much of the power. Well, before Trump came in, I would say that there was a little bit of a disguise, right? There was more of a pretense that we, the people, had the power, and there were these corporations that had power too, but we were kind of all vying for power. And then there were things like the Supreme Court decision that said corporations are basically people, and free speech is the right to give massive amounts of money to our elected officials. And so there was less and less of a cover. The veneer was starting to come off. And there comes Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, there's no veneer anymore. It's like not even trying to have any veneer there. I mean, would you ever think that in your lifetime, the CEO of an oil company would become the Secretary of State? Did you ever think you would see that? That would be something in the satirical paper like The Onion would say that, yeah. And when they first announced it, I thought, oh, come on, that's a joke. And then, like, he's one of the more rational people in the government, is the CEO of ExxonMobil. And so Trump has brought in the very Wall Street swamp that he was supposed to drain. He's brought in the CEOs of oil companies, and he's brought in more generals than we've had in high office since World War II. So the government now is the corporate government. There is no attempt to really separate that. And so, you know, we, the people, can do as much as we want of the lobbying and the meeting with the interns and all of that. Well, we're not going to get too far in this government. And so I think it means that our work is at the local level to a good extent. But it also means how are we going to use this moment on our side to really show how far we've gotten from a democracy of one person, one vote, how far we've gotten from a democracy where we, the people, rule. And so it is a tremendous opportunity. And I know in the work that I've been doing around foreign policy issues, it's been so hard to get people to care about these issues, especially during the Obama years. I know many of you in this room were very involved during the Bush years, and we got people out in these massive demonstrations. Remember, some of you will have remembered February 15th, 2003, when we had the massive demonstrations, not only in this country but around the world, saying the world says no to war, to say don't attack Iraq. And it was really glorious to see how we were able to mobilize. And during the 8 years, we kept mobilizing. I think there were 8 times that we had mobilizations of more than 100,000 people at one time. That's a lot of work. But we didn't get a lot to show for it because the invasion of Iraq happened, the US got involved in all of these wars, people got exhausted from all this mobilizing without a lot to show for it. And then there were other more important issues, like the collapse of the economy, where people had to turn inward and look at how am I going to keep my job, how am I going to keep my home, how am I going to get through school, and other issues that became much more important to people. And in the meantime, we used that momentum of the anti-war movement to get Barack Obama into office. And people thought that he was a peace president and he was going to get us out of these wars. And that's another reason why people tended to kind of put the wars on the back burner. And so we had 8 years of wars that people were totally in the dark about because they started using things like drone warfare, so our own soldiers didn't get killed, but we were killing a lot of civilians in other countries. And we were involved in bombing of 7 different countries. Does anybody have an idea how many bombs were dropped under the last year of the Obama administration, just in 2016 alone? Anyone want to take a guess? Throw out a number. No, that's too many. What? 1,000. 26,712. 26,712. In 1 year alone by a peace president who won the Nobel Peace Prize. 26,712. I mean, that's disgusting. That's absolutely disgusting. You know, some of those bombs cost $1 million per bomb. Imagine what we could have done with 26,000 of them. So we are involved in all of these wars and supporting all kinds of repressive regimes. You mentioned in the intro, Ted, that I was beaten up in Egypt. And I was beaten up in Egypt after there was a coup. And we had friends who were dying in the streets, over 1,000 people killed. And they said, where is the international community? 40,000 people were rounded up and put in prison. And so we went there to be in support. And I didn't get any further than the airport. I got into the airport, and they looked at my name and on some computer, and they said, come with me. I did one of the stupidest things in my life is I was alone. There were like 99 other people that were going to be joining me, but I was like setting things up, so I said I better get there early to make sure everything was set up. Well, it was a big mistake because I was taken into a separate room, I was interrogated, I was then put into a jail cell, and they kept me there overnight. And in the morning said that they were going to deport me, and I had been in touch with the US Embassy, and the embassy said, we're on our way, hold them off, we're coming, we're coming. And so I said, you know, the embassy's on its way, there's some, you know, mix-up here, and that's when they dragged me out on the floor, stomping on me, 5 guys beating me up, my shoulder dislocated, tremendous, tremendous pain, and instead of taking me to the hospital to get treated, put me on a plane to Turkey, where the luckiest thing that happened to me in that whole time is that while I'm screaming out in pain on the plane, there happened to be an orthopedic surgeon on the plane who gave me a shot, put me out, reset my arm. But the US has a law in the books that says when there's a coup, we're not supposed to support that government anymore. Do you know that even under the Obama administration, with John Kerry, who I have a lot of respect for, in power, the US continued to support the coup government? And you know why? We went and we lobbied really, really hard. Do you know what they said? They said most of the money, we give $1.3 billion to Egypt. They said most of the money has already been committed to the US weapons industry. And those are contracts that we have to make good on. And so the money is going to go to those contractors anyway. So the money to, quote, Egypt is really another subsidy to our weapons industry. So we give massive amounts of subsidies to repressive regimes. Now, I know the issue of Israel continues to be a contentious issue, and maybe that's when you said that I was going to be controversial. You were maybe thinking of that? Perhaps. But as somebody from the Jewish community who has really studied this issue and spent a lot of time from the time I was 16 years old living on a kibbutz in Israel, I have come to the conclusion that Israel is indeed an apartheid state, and that it has tremendous violations every single day of the Palestinian people, which is terrible for the Palestinians, terrible for the Israelis, and terrible for us, because we in this country are subsidizing the Israeli military to the tune of over $3 billion every year. And this might still not be clear to the majority of Americans, but you know what? It's clear to people throughout the Arab world. And they see the U.S. supporting the Israeli government in its repression of the Palestinian people, and it makes a lot of people hate us. And so I see the U.S. continuing to support very repressive regimes. I was just this last couple of days protesting outside the annual meetings of a strong pro-Israeli government lobby group called AIPAC. And every year I go out and protest there. And every year, inevitably, people come up to me and say, you know, this is horrible what you're doing, and you don't know anything about this, and you don't know what happened to the Jewish people. And I said, you know, I am Jewish. And they said, no, you can't be Jewish. If you were Jewish, you wouldn't be here doing this. And one time somebody said, you know, prove that you're Jewish. If I was a guy, maybe I'd have a way to do it. So the only thing I could think of is an expression my mother used to say to me, which is "gay cock enough and yum," which is like go shit in the ocean, right? So I told this woman to go shit in the ocean, and she looked at me and she said, "You're Jewish." But they would inevitably always be saying to me, why are you picking on poor Israel? Why don't you pick on some of these repressive Arab regimes? And they would always say, like Saudi Arabia. And I heard it year after year after year. And it started to sink into me. Why aren't we picking on Saudi Arabia? And I realized that as a progressive group, we just put blinders on when it came to Saudi Arabia. And part of it, I had to admit to myself, is because we didn't want to fall into the Islamophobia and be criticizing a regime that was a Muslim regime and perhaps be seen as criticizing Muslims. And was it my place, again, as a Jewish woman, to be criticizing a Muslim country? And I realized that, yes, it is my place. And I talked to a lot of Muslim friends, and I said, you know, how do you feel about me really focusing on Saudi Arabia? And they said, we need people to focus on Saudi Arabia because they are making us all look bad. Their version of Islam, they said to me, please call it a perversion of Islam because it has nothing to do with the type of compassionate, loving Islam that the vast majority of people in the world practice. And so I felt empowered then to go and really learn and focus on Saudi Arabia. And that's why I wrote the book, and I hope you'll get a copy of it because I think it's really important for progressives to understand because it's key to a lot of issues that we're dealing with right now. And if we ever want to unravel the mess that we're in the Middle East, we have to look at this pact with the devil that we've made with Saudi Arabia. And so in the book, I write it in a very simple Q&A kind of format, and I go back to the founding of Saudi Arabia that goes to the pact that was made between this intolerant cleric, Mohammed Wahhab, and that's where Wahhabism comes from, and the very ambitious and ruthless Saudi family that is the basis of this Saud regime, the Saudi regime, and the literal marriage between those families so that the Saudi regime used religion as a justification to take over more and more land in the Arab Peninsula to conquer Mecca and Medina, the Holy Lands, and to create this kingdom of Saudi Arabia that I am absolutely sure that from the time it was created in 1932, it would not be around today. It would have been overthrown by its own people, disgusted with this one family trying to seize all of the wealth, or would have been overthrown by a neighboring country had it not been for the United States. And so as we criticize Saudi Arabia, we have to look in the mirror and say, who has held up this regime since 1932? It is administration after administration, Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, and it has been all about oil. The discovery of oil in the 1930s meant that the US wanted to have a very close relationship with this regime so that the oil companies could get filthy rich and sell cheap oil here in the United States, which is the basis of our economy. And so we have kept this regime in power. And in the meantime, it is one of the most repressive regimes in the world. I mean, I think it's quite funny that when I go to these hearings in Congress all the time, they're always talking about Iran being the enemy. Iran is this, Iran is that, Iran is the basis of all evil, Iran is extremist group. And they say Iran doesn't have free and fair elections. I say, well, at least they have elections. Saudi Arabia, they don't even try to have national elections. There's no political parties. There's no freedom of association. There's no freedom of expression. The reign of power has been from the original king to the son, to the son, to the son, to the son, and now the last son is so old and crotchety that they're basically in a crisis about who's going to get the next reign of power. But it's been one family for decades. And the only way they can stay in power is to repress their people, so that free thought, free speech is considered antithetical. And, you know, Donald Trump has said, oh, look at ISIS, which is terrible. I'm not pretending ISIS isn't terrible, but he says, look at the way they behead people. We haven't seen this since the Middle Ages. And I say, hello, look at Saudi Arabia, they do it all the time. That's their favorite way of instituting the death penalty, is chopping people's heads off in public squares. In fact, there's a square that's known as Chop Chop Square, because that's where they chop people's heads off. There's even a thing called their own version of crucifixion in Saudi Arabia, where they chop the head off and then they put the body up on a pole and they keep it out there for several days with the head off the side, as a warning to other people. And so there are all kinds of reasons that you could get the death penalty. I would think that some of you in this room would be eligible for the death penalty if you lived in Saudi Arabia. How many atheists do we have in this place of worship? In danger. How many people identify with the LGBT community? Sorry. How many sorcerers do we have in the room? I know we got one here. All of these would be reason. There are people who have been put for long-term prison sentences for tweets that they put out, for blogs that they put out. We were this afternoon in Hofstra, where it was a day to look at women's issues, and I was talking about the role of the way that women are treated in Saudi Arabia. It is the country that most discriminates against women. It's not only that it's the only country where women are not allowed to drive, and believe me, there is no rational reason. You cannot find it in the Quran. They didn't say women can't drive. It's a power trip. It's all a power trip, how to keep women down. And the worst thing is this guardianship system where you have to have a male who is your legal guardian to determine everything you're going to do in your life of significance. If you're going to get married, who are you going to get married? If you're going to work, if you're going to travel, all of these things, a man has to sign off to let you do this. That is Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, where a theocracy, you would think, well, they have some respect for freedom of religion. No, they only have respect for the religion that they profess as part of Wahhabism, the way they want you to practice Islam. If you want to practice Islam in another way, like a very light way like the Sufis do with dance and with music, that is discriminated against. If you are of the Shia minority, you're discriminated against the entire eastern part of the country. 10% of the population is Shia. constantly discriminated against. And in fact, the eastern part of the country is where the vast oil resources are. You would think they would be the richest people, but no, they don't get the big contracts, they get the lowly jobs. And then there are the non-Muslims who live in Saudi Arabia because there's a big foreign worker force, 2 million Christians. It is illegal to have a church. It's illegal to publicly practice a religion other than Islam. And until 2004, it was illegal if you were Jewish to even come into the country. So this is a country that has no respect for freedom of religion and no respect for the workers, the foreign workers who come in, because it is like a modern slavery, the way foreign workers are treated who are coming from poor countries like Bangladesh and India and the Philippines, and you have to have a sponsor. So say you wanted to bring a worker in to clean your house and drive your wife around and do your construction jobs or whatever it is. You sponsor that worker, and when that worker appears, the employer often confiscates the passport and treats the worker like a slave. And the worker cannot even leave the country without not only getting the passport back, but having an exit visa, and the only one who could give you the exit visa is your employer. And so there's just terrible, terrible stories of the way that workers are treated by some very nasty Saudi employers. Of course, not all of them, but some of them are. So you have a country where people are taught that anybody who is not Muslim is an infidel. Anybody who is not a Sunni Muslim practicing Wahhabism is an infidel. And guess what? It's okay to kill infidels. And that's why you see the influence of Saudi Arabia is at the root of so many of these extremist groups, like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS. And it's not only the ideology. And of course, the Saudi government was very embarrassed when they found out in the places in the schools that ISIS was controlling. Guess what textbooks they were using? The Saudi texts, because that's the very same ideology of these groups. But it's worse than that. Saudi Arabia, people inside Saudi Arabia, it's very hard to distinguish who is part of the government and who isn't part of the government, because the wealthy people tend to be part of the government. There are thousands of princes. And they have been funding these extremist groups. They have used their oil wealth to not only set up mosques and schools and spread the ideology, but they literally are funding these extremist groups. Well, you might say, well, how do I know that? And maybe I'm just making this up. Guess what? We have cables that have been leaked by WikiLeaks that show that our government was fully aware that people within the Saudi government were funding these extremist groups. We have cables from Hillary Clinton herself. We have talks by Joe Biden. You know, Joe Biden, bless his soul, he often was not able to kind of keep things in, and he was talking once to a student group at Northwestern University, and he said, some of our biggest problems in the Middle East are our own allies, like the Saudis. They keep funding these extremist groups. And when he got back to the White House, they said, Joe, you can't say that. The Saudis are really furious with you. And he had to take it back, apologize. But in the meantime, we have these cables where Hillary Clinton is like pulling her hair out and say, what are we going to do about the Saudis? They keep funding these extremist groups. So I want you to just sit back for a minute and just take this in, that our government has been telling us since the 9/11 attacks that we have a war on terror. This war on terror has sucked up about $5 trillion of our money, massive amounts of money. We've had the lives of US soldiers that have been killed, many of them in Iraq and Afghanistan, in this war on terror. We have destroyed entire nations, like the nation of Iraq, in this war on terror. Why are we allied with the very government that is most responsible for the terrorism? Why, when Donald Trump came in and he said, we're going to make America safe by putting a Muslim ban, and first named 7 countries and then pared it down to 6 countries, how come Saudi Arabia was never on that list? How come the country that furnished 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11, the Saudis? The Saudis are really the only ones that you can point to. I don't say that anybody should be banned from this country according to to their country of origin. But if you were going to have any rationale to a Muslim ban, the very first country on that list would have to be Saudi Arabia. And yet it was never on that list. And so, yes, part of it is this addiction to oil we have, but the other part of it takes me back to General Eisenhower and his warning about the power of the military-industrial complex. Because guess who has become by far the largest purchaser of US weapons? Saudi Arabia. By far the largest purchaser of weapons. And you know, here we are, the Western democracy, prides ourselves in our democracy. We're arming to the teeth this repressive regime. But guess what? It's not only us. The largest purchaser of weapons from the Canadians is Saudi Arabia. The largest purchaser of weapons from Germany is Saudi Arabia. The largest purchaser of weapons from the French is Saudi Arabia. And that lovely Scandinavian country, Sweden, that we look towards to say, wouldn't it be nice if we had this kind of social democracy, is a big weapons manufacturer. And the #1 purchaser of their weapons is Saudi Arabia. The entire Western democratic world is making a lot of money from selling weapons to this incredibly disgusting repressive regime. And what is that regime doing with the money? With the weapons, repressing their own people. They are going into neighboring countries at the time of the Arab Spring and crushing beautiful democratic uprisings like in the neighboring Bahrain, where people were so excited that they were going to get a chance to have a democratic government, and the Saudis rolled in with our tanks to crush them. And then what they have been doing in the last 2 years in the country of Yemen is absolutely appalling. Yemen, I've been there. It's a beautiful country in terms of its old traditions. The capital of Sana'a is just an extraordinary UNESCO heritage site. But it's a poor country. It's always been a poor country. They don't have oil. They don't have natural resources. A poor country. There was a dictatorship in Yemen. People rose up against that dictatorship, put a government in place that was temporary. It looked like that government was going to try to entrench itself. And so a group called the Houthis rose up and said, no, we don't think this is going in a democratic direction. And then there is a civil war. The Houthis practice a religion that is closer to the Shia. And the Saudis were worried that Iran, which is a Shia country, was going to get a foothold next door. And so they said, just kind of like George Bush, we're going to throw a couple of bombs in there, we're going to put our guy in place, and everything will be okay. Well, that was 2 years ago. We're on the 3rd year. In fact, this week marks the anniversary, beginning of the 3rd year, of the Saudi-led bombing campaign of this already poor country has absolutely devastated the country. We hear somewhat about the tremendous devastation in Syria. We're hearing a little bit more about the devastation in Iraq. We hear almost nothing about what is being done to Yemen. And what is being done to Yemen is something we are so directly involved in. Even the Senator, Chris Murphy from Connecticut, has said because we are furnishing the weapons and refueling the planes in the air and giving all kinds of logistical support, that we have the blood of the Yemeni people on our hands. And it's not just the over 10,000 people who have been killed, which is a lot of people, but that pales by comparison to the people who are now dying of hunger there. Hunger, you know, is not a phenomenon that just happens. It's not just a weather thing, like there's a drought or something. Usually, when there is a famine, it's a combination of issues. And when you look at the famine that is now looming in Yemen, it is because of the war. And because of the war, the Saudis have been bombing the water treatment plants, the sewage system, the electric plants. They have been bombing all kinds of civilian sites. They have destroyed the livelihood of so many people. And they bombed the cranes in the biggest port where the humanitarian aid comes in, and that's a port called Hudaida. And they bombed the cranes so that food aid is now not able to get in anywhere near sufficient amounts. And so you have 7 million people who are going hungry now in Yemen. You have every 10 minutes, according to the UN, a baby dying in Yemen because of a lack of food and a lack of medical facilities, because over half of the medical facilities have been bombed. They're no longer functioning. And so here we are kind of blithely going along our activities day after day and not recognizing that people are dying of hunger because of our policies. And now Donald Trump comes in and he's going to make things even worse, because there was, at the end of Obama's time in office, and I must say, Obama sold massive amounts of weapons to the Saudis, $115 billion worth of weapons. The largest sales of weapons to the Saudis came under the Obama administration. But at the end of his administration, after 8 years, in fact, in December, before he was leaving office, I think he came to realize how awful this had all become, because he saw the reports of how many civilian sites were being targeted by the Saudis. And then there was a funeral that was hit in which a massive number of civilians were killed. And basically, Obama said enough is enough. And he said, I'm going to put a halt on new weapons sales. And the Saudis wanted to attack the entire port of Hodeidah, and that would have meant no humanitarian aid coming in. And he said no. Donald Trump has come in, and the Secretary of State, former CEO of ExxonMobil, has said the weapons should be continued. And he is also, the Secretary of Defense has put a memo in, this was just exposed by the Washington Post 2 days ago, saying that we should support the Saudi-led coalition in their attack on the port. So we might see what the UN has called a catastrophe that in the next 3 months, if this attack goes through and if nothing is done about it, a massive millions of people dying of hunger. Now, we know about it. We've been warned by the UN. Will we do anything about it? What can we do about it? So we at Code Pink, we have sign-up sheets. We are what? Yes. If you would sign up so that we can stay in touch with you. We're organizing the week of April 10th to 16th, together with groups like Voices for Creative Nonviolence, a fast for a week in front of the UN. If anybody wants to join that, we're asking people to pick one lunch on April 13th and skip that lunch and send your money, your lunch money, to a group like UNICEF. And we're asking people to do this, and I think we're going to be asking them every month to be doing this, to raise awareness. It's a small thing we can do, but it's a small thing that will start, hopefully, the ball rolling and get more and more people, get faith-based communities to do it, get elected officials to do it. We have to do more to raise the awareness about what is happening there. But the UN put out a call and said we need $2.1 billion. The US has given like 50 million. And we need a massive amount of money going for humanitarian assistance. But if we're really going to save people's lives, we have to stop the war. So there has to be a ceasefire. There has to be an end to the arms sales. And that's, in general, the solution for the Middle East everywhere. Whether you're talking about Syria, whether you're talking about Iraq, there are not military solutions to these problems. There has to be an end to the fighting. There has to be an end to this constant arms buildup. You know that US weapons are in every side, in every fight in the Middle East. No matter where you look, if it's an al-Qaeda group, they're using US weapons. If it's a group that's the Iraqi government, it's US weapons. All over the place, it's US weapons. So I think I want to sort of round the circle here to say that so much of what Martin Luther King told us in his brilliant April 4th speech that we are now coming to the 50th anniversary of, his famous Riverside Church speech, is something we should listen to today and recognize the depth of those words and how much they resonate today. We had General Eisenhower warning us about the military-industrial complex, and we have Martin Luther King, who 50 years ago warned us about the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. And those triple evils certainly continue to this day. And when we look at what Martin Luther King said, and I did have in my notes to read you the end of the speech, but he did talk about how we have to go to jail. We have to do civil disobedience. We have to, as he said, get scarred up a bit, spend time in these hot, disgusting, oppressive prisons in the United States. We have to get out there and we have to show our opposition. And I think it's been beautiful when we see, since Trump came in, the kind of resistance that has sprung up. When you look at the massive women's march that happened the day after the inauguration, I mean, what a way to say to Donald Trump, you do not represent my values, than having hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets all over this country in a march for women's rights. And I don't know if people know Charlotte's hat here and the symbolism of this hat. Can you stand up for a second? I won't say the name of the hat, but these hats became a symbol of resistance. And women all over, not only over the country, women all over the world were knitting these hats. And I know because our group at Code Pink became the repository for thousands and thousands of these hats. They would come by the truckloads, and they would empty out trucks of these hats in our Code Pink house. The entire living room was full to the brim of all of these hats. And the beautiful thing about it is you would open up each package, and each package would have a message from the woman who knitted the hat. And each one would be a message saying, I am from Finland. I am appalled by the person who is now going to be in the White House, and I want to show my solidarity with the people from the United States. Or a Native American woman saying, this is exactly the wrong values and the wrong direction that this country is going to. I can't be there myself. I don't have the money to do it, but I knitted this hat, and I hope you'll take a picture and send it to me. And every single one of them had a message like that. What a beautiful way to be able to bring in the joy of women's knitting circles and allow people to participate even if they couldn't physically be there. And then when we had the Muslim ban, people spontaneously going to the airports. I mean, that was quite extraordinary to see that happening. I was telling the young folks today at Hofstra that I was really disappointed that I wasn't in a place where there was a big airport like JFK or Dulles. I was traveling in Texas, and we were near the Dallas airport and decided to go and see if anything was happening in the Dallas airport, and I thought, oh, maybe there'd be a small group. There was such a large group, you couldn't even enter the airport. It was enormous, and it was all of these Muslim families that had come there, and their kids had set up a station with free pizza, and they were giving out little candy kisses to everybody who came, and the Muslim women were there with their arms open, welcoming and kissing everybody who arrived, and these lovely white women were all dressed up in their Southern best, and they were making signs there, and the signs to cheer people on, and flowers. Whoever came out of the airport, and people were like, wow, why are they cheering me? And the sign said, this is what Southern hospitality looks like. And it was so beautiful that everybody there was hugging and crying and kissing each other. And you thought, this is the America that I want to be part of. This is the America that I feel proud of. This is the America that, ironically enough, Donald Trump is bringing out in us. So I think as we go forward and we take the words of Martin Luther King and we take the words of the people who have come before us to move us in the direction of making our country better and better and better, order. Let's recognize that it's through these very difficult times in our history, like the McCarthy era, that we got the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the LGBTQ movement. They come out of dark times, and we are in those times right now. Will we move into a way of fascism and show that our country doesn't have strong enough democratic levers to resist Trump? I don't think so. I think we're going to move in the opposite direction. The fact that in this little bit of time, we've been able to stop the Muslim ban in its tracks twice. We've been able to stop the overturn of Obamacare, extraordinary. We've been able to do some amazing things, shows that we have enough people with enough guts and gumption who are out there in these new groups that have come up, groups like Indivisible, groups like Our Revolution, groups like Move On, groups like these your local alliances. I think we will be able to show the American people and show the world that we indeed will stand up to the worst of Donald Trump, that we indeed will show the world that the American people are at heart good people who don't want to live with hatred and fear and division, but want to live in a world where we are generous and kind and loving. Let's build that resistance movement and show that we can indeed overcome Donald Trump and build an America that will indeed be great. Thank you so much.
You talked about the people who came before us and said things. I'm a big fan of Gore Vidal, and Gore Vidal said, 50 years ago in The Nation, he said, the United States is a one-party government with two right wings, the Democratic and the Republican. And we now know from everything that you've talked about that that's the case. Should we all get up and fight against this? Of course. But what do you feel, how do you think, what kind of impact can we have when, as you said, the moneyed people go into a room, and in that room, that's where everything gets done? Two right wings, the Democratic and Republican. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, on the other hand, we have so many examples in our history where we even had conservative people in power and forced the government to do things that we wanted them to do. And so I really think that our lesson should be that we've got to try to find all different tactics. I think people who still have the faith in trying to make the Democratic Party more representative should stick in the Democratic Party. I think the Bernie Sanders wing in the party has gone through a lot and been beaten and battered, but is still there and is still strong. And I think that especially the young people who got involved in the Sanders campaign, I mean, did you see during the election that there was this poll that was done that said that the millennials had a better view of socialism than they did of capitalism? Quite extraordinary. I think there's a lot of young people who are leading these new movements, who understand now it's not just a question of who is in power. It's not just a question of elections, although we have to make our electoral system a fair one. There are a lot of people who are sick of the two parties and want to really build up a strong third party. There are a lot of people who are sick of the whole electoral system and say it's all about building on the grassroots level. I don't think that we know what the right tactic is. And I'm glad there's people still willing to work within the Democratic Party. I think the fact that Keith Ellison came very close to being the head, the chairperson of the party, showed the power of the progressive wing of the party. So I would say go where your heart lies, work in whatever movement you feel is going to be the most effective. But the worst thing to do is to give up. And the worst thing to do is to listen to people who are apocalyptic right now, calling this a fascist state, and really giving the sense that there's nothing you can do, because then it will be a fascist state, and then it will come true that there will be nothing we can do. I think there's plenty we can do. I think we have a lot of, when I compare what we can do in this country to what the people in Saudi Arabia can do, we have a lot of democratic openings, and we better flex that muscle or we will indeed lose it.
Thank you, Medea, for your inspiring presentation and your moral courage. Speaking of Saudi Arabia, I find it so puzzling that President Obama, who had offered us so much to admire, notably the Affordable Care Act as far as it went, which thank goodness we still have, would give so much money and so much weaponry to Saudi Arabia. Was he deluded into thinking it was some kind of force of stability in the Middle East, or was he beholden to oil interests for all his commitment to curbing climate change? Why do you suppose he had that kind of policy?
I think that part of it is deluded to think that the Saudis are a source of stability in the Middle East. I think part of it is that it was a trade-off in his nuclear deal with Iran. Because the Iranians and the Saudis hate each other, and the Saudis did not want the nuclear deal to go through. The fact that President Obama was really committed to the nuclear deal, which was a great thing, I think the best foreign policy thing that he did in his 8 years, he made the trade-offs. And one of the trade-offs was that they would give greater technological weapons to the Saudis.
Hi, Medea. I'm Leonard Zerman. I heard Dr. King speak 3 times, twice in Great Neck and once in Washington. Now I've heard you speak 3 times, once here, twice here, and once at a Green Party event with Jill Stein, my dear friend Jill Stein, for 48 years. She is my dear friend, but I have a lot of trouble with the Green Party, and I really want to hear your perspective on it. When I heard you speak last time, it was so eloquent, I suggested you should have been her running mate, and I still think that's true. I want to hear what you have to say to us who believe that the Green Party has something to offer, but maybe we made a terrible mistake in that the margin by which Trump won the Rust Belt states was smaller than the amount of votes that we, the Green Party, got in those states. When Ralph Nader ran in 2000, I sent him a cable, run, Ralph, run, but not in the swing states. I felt the same way about Jill, but we didn't go that way, did we? Should we have? What should we do now in the Green Party? Thank you.
When Ralph ran several times, and I ran for office in California when Ralph was running in 2000, I thought it was so important that his voice was out there. And I still think it's important his voice is out there, and I think it's important that we have a multi-party system in this country, not a one-party system with 2 right wings. But we do have what we have right now, and so I was of the faction that said, focus on the swing states. On the safe states, because this country is so big, so vast, you can't go everywhere anyway. You might as well focus. Do people know what it means, the safe states, the ones that are going to go for the Democratic Party, and so it really doesn't matter, or the ones that you know are going to go for the Republican Party, and so it really doesn't matter. But I would never fault the Green Party for the problems that we have. I think that you can name out 20 different reasons why Al Gore didn't win, and you can name 21 different reasons why Hillary Clinton didn't win, and I think Hillary Clinton was just a terrible candidate, and that the Democratic Party doesn't want to admit it, and the Democratic Party did so many maneuvers to keep Bernie Sanders from getting that nomination, and I really do think Bernie Sanders would have beat Donald Trump. So, but I also disagree with the direction of the Green Party right now, because I think that the way the Green Party should work is at the local level. I really think the focus should be on getting people elected in school boards, on city councils, very, very local things where, 1, you have a chance to get elected, and 2, you can make some difference. And so I think all of this attention on running people at congressional levels and national levels is really a distraction from the important work and perhaps a little less glamorous work of running people at the local level. And when I ran for office in 2000, I knew I was never going to beat my opponent, who is Dianne Feinstein. I mean, she's like a relic in there. She just doesn't go away. And but I said, okay, I want to build 20 chapters of the Green Party in places where we don't have them in California. And I focused on doing that. And I felt really proud at the end of the campaign that at least we had accomplished something that had some roots to it. But I don't think that's done enough in the Green Party.
When Donald Trump got elected, the American Civil Liberties Union got $24 million. And we need people on the local level, your local chapter, your Nassau chapter, your Suffolk chapter, to work with that money, to do it locally. All politics are local. So think about joining a group. You know, this is very nice to come here, and I love Medea, but go out now and join.
Hi, my name is Lynn Smith. I'm a member of this congregation, and we have an organization called LIAC, the Long Island Area Council, which unites all 11 UU congregations on Long Island. We formed a task force a couple days after the election, and we decided to work together as 5 of us from 5 different congregations to figure out how to get the message out in a way that was organized for everybody. What we started doing is the first Monday of every month, we have what's called a round table at the Huntington UU. It's the first Monday of every month at 6:45, and you get a wonderful soup and salad dinner along with about an hour and a half or 2 hours of networking. We invite each time 2 local groups to come and present to us on what they're doing. They've been organizing some of these town hall meetings out east, and so we have this round table going. There's also a fantastic website that the Progressive Coalition puts out. You can Google it. It's called Progressive Network. It comes out every week. And I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it states day by day what's happening, where it's happening, and who's doing it. In fact, this coming Saturday, in the UU congregation of the Great South Bay, there will be an ACLU workshop going on there. So you can come and meet some representatives. But I think get active. Follow the links and find out where things are going on and come out and join these groups. Thank you.
So thank you, and let me just close by saying that if you're not connected to a local group, I hope in the time that we're having our reception outside, you'll speak to some of the local organizers. You might want to also make sure you're signed up with some of the national groups, like the group Indivisible that has sprung up since Donald Trump came in and has thousands of groups all over the country. A Bernie Sanders campaign has turned into this group called Our Revolution that puts out great things constantly. MoveOn.org has been doing some wonderful organizing. I hope that we'll stay in touch with you as Code Pink, because we've been focusing on a lot of these national foreign policy issues. There's a lot of great groups that have really either sprung up or gotten a new incentive and a lot of new people joining them. So this is the time to feel like we have to build our communities, we have to build our organizations, and to recognize that everything is local. And while I love it that we're having big national mobilizing, like the climate march coming up at the end of this month, April 29th, the most important work that we can do is in our own communities. And for that, I want to give a big thank you to this church and the groups here that have been doing this work for a long time. time, and I appreciate all the wonderful work you've been doing and hope that it will bear even greater fruits in this time. Thank you.